Hello, this is a short lecture. It's the introductory lecture to the module Introduction to Technology and Education. This is what I'm going to be covering in this short lecture. I'm going to talk a little bit about the meaning of educational technology. What does it mean? I'm going to start to talk a little bit about how technology is used in different contexts and by different learners. And later on, as part of the session today, I'm not going to talk about this in detail in this lecture, but as part of your preparation for our discussion, our live discussion this week, we're going to talk about the assessment of the module. So I'm the module leader. If you need to contact me directly about anything about this module, there's my email address, reada3@lsbu.ac.uk. So I'm Andrew Reed, and that's my email contact point. And this is a link or a reminder about what the core reading is for this particular module. It's called Education and Technology by Neil Selwyn. It's available as an ebook in the LSBU library. So I'll refer quite a lot to Selwyn, and when you come to the assignment for this module, Selwyn is one of the key texts that I will expect you to refer to. We've got several learning outcomes for the module. This is about understanding the role that technology plays in different educational contexts. So when I talk about educational contexts, I'm talking about nurseries, reception classes, primary schools, secondary schools, further educational settings, universities, adult education settings, etc., etc. So the whole range of educational contexts. And some of those contexts might not be institutions. So one of the things that we talk about a little bit in this module is how you could use technology to access learning outside conventional, traditional educational contexts. So technology is used, for example, for supporting distance learning and for supporting people who are studying, for example, at home. We're thinking critically about the use of technology. So the second learning outcome is just to flag up the idea that we are not simply going to accept that technology is just brilliant. We're going to question that. We're going to explore how technology is used and how genuinely it supports the learning of learners and how it effectively supports the way that teachers teach. Intellectual skills, we're looking at the application of theory to practice. So when I talk about theory, I'm talking about the stuff we read in books or the stuff we read in journals. Practice is what practically happens in the classroom or in the learning environment. So we're looking at the relationship between what people, teachers, learners actually do in the classroom and what people say when they write about these things in books. So the stuff in books is theory, the stuff that actually happens in the classroom is practice. And we're looking at the relationship between those two things. And finally, the last learning outcome there, which is about challenging our assumptions. So I want us to get to a point where we're starting to ask ourselves how technology actually supports learning, to question that, not simply to accept it, but to ask ourselves questions about how genuinely it supports learning. So to start with, for this module, I want you to think about some of these terms. I want you to think about the meaning of the word education. What does it mean? I want you to think about the word learning. What does the word learning actually mean? What happens when we learn? What occurs when you learn something? And finally, to think about learning, ask yourself whether learning is a product. So is learning something to do with what you get at the end, what's produced at the end, or is it a process? Is it a journey, if you like? Is it arriving at the place where you're trying to get to? That would be a product. Or is it the journey that you take to get to that piece of learning? So I want you to start to think about those questions when you're thinking about this module. And when we come to talk about the assignment, This is a way that you might think about the beginning of an essay. If you were writing about technology and education, you might actually think about some of these questions and use literature to support your thinking about these questions. And here are some examples of what the literature says about that word learning. So these are definitions of learning. So we've got one from Illich. I don't need to read it for you. It's there on the page. So think about what Illich says. And my question to you there is to think about how much does what Illich says that learning is, how much is that the same that what you think? Has Illich summed up your own thinking there about what learning is, or do you have a different way of thinking about learning? Brunner, a little bit later, some 25 years after Illich, talks about the idea of learning being not just a technical business. It's something more complex than that. So again, ask yourself, what do you think about learning? Is it simply for you? Is it a technical business? Is it a process of just getting some information into your head, or is it more complex than that? And Svard there, who is writing, is reported by Selwyn. So that's an example of a secondary reference. Selwyn is the book that I've referred you to earlier on. Svard talks about learning being about participation rather than acquisition. So participation is about joining in with others, being part of a group, collaboration. Acquisition is just getting something. If you acquire something, you just get it. But Svard is arguing that it's more than just getting something, it's more complex than that. And here are some other authors talking about the word education, the meaning of the word education. So we've got Rogers there talking about what I would say is perhaps formal education, where you've got more organised learning environments. An organised learning environment might, for example, be a school or a nursery or a university or a college. That's an organised learning environment, a formal learning environment. And Rogers talks about learners being learning conscious. So they are aware of the learning that is going on. They're conscious. They know what's happening. Mills and Craftle talk about informal education. So the idea that actually we're learning all the time. You don't need to be at a school or a university or a college to learn. It's something that's happening throughout our life. In all of our interactions with the world, we are learning. And finally, we've got that definition from Selwyn, the idea that education can be best understood as the conditions and arrangements where learning takes place. So Selwyn's kind of rounding up that whole thing and giving us quite a broad-based definition of what education might be. So again, ask yourself, to what extent do these words, this language, relate to your own understanding of the meaning of education? And then another word to think about. So we've already talked about learning, and I've talked about education, and here's another word to think about: technology. What do we mean by technology? And technology, in the loosest sense, is something that is used to make our lives easier. So over the centuries, the things that are technology have shifted. So before, for example, the invention of the pencil, before pencils existed, people had to do other things to record their ideas. And then somebody came up with the technology of the pencil, and that pencil made it easier for people to write down their ideas. But before the pencil was invented, there weren't pencils. So the pencil is a piece of technology. In this last century, towards the end of the last century, you have all of these digital technologies. Before they came along, they didn't exist. So they came along, and in theory, these things help us. So the thing to start to ask yourself is to what extent does the technology that you use, your iPhone, your laptop computer, your mobile technology, how does it actually help you in the process of learning? And there's a little bit of stuff there that kind of backs up those ideas. So we've got the words of Selwyn. So Selwyn says that technology is the process by which humans modify nature. Volti says technologies are developed and applied so that we can do things not otherwise possible. So back to the example of the pencil. Before the pencil, the implements that people used to write things down were different. And it might have been that they were more complicated to use or messier. So perhaps the pencil enabled them to do something in a neater way that they weren't able to do before. What about your iPhone? What does your iPhone or your held mobile phone, what does that enable you to do that you weren't otherwise able to do? But it's important there also that iTech says that technology is more than just machines. So technology, as I've said, I've given the example of the pencil, it's not just a machine. Technology can be other things that basically enable us to do things that we could not otherwise do. And they're, again, reported in Selwyn, but the ideas of Mackenzie and Vachman, 3 elements of technology. We've got the physical object. So let's think about your mobile phone. I'm sure that you all have a mobile phone. So the object, that's one element of technology. And then another element of technology is what we do with the object. It's the human activity that occurs in conjunction with, together with, the physical object. So it's not just the technology is the mobile phone, but it's also technology is the thing that we do with the mobile phone. That's technology. And also it's the knowledge that relates to these objects and this use. So it's the way we talk about what we do with the mobile phone. 3 elements. It's the phone, for example, it's what we do with the phone, and it's what we talk about when we are describing and developing our understanding of what we do with the phone. 3 elements of technology. So some things to start to think about now. So what technology do you use? And what do you do with the technology? How do you use it? So what devices do you use, and what do you use those devices for? And think all the time about education. To what extent do your uses of technology relate to education, learning? We've got mobile phones, laptops, iPads, your handheld device, etc., etc., and audio devices as well. One of the things we're going to be talking about more generally in this module is we're going to talk about how technology is specifically used in the classroom. So start to think now about how technology was used when you were at primary school or at secondary school or at college. How was it used to support learning? What difference did it make? How did it improve your learning? And most importantly, how do you know how it improved your learning? So for example, I'll talk quite a lot about the interactive whiteboard, the IWB, that you find in lots of primary and secondary classrooms. Schools spend lots of money on interactive whiteboards. How do they help learning? What do they do that makes learning better, that improves learning? Start to ask yourself critical questions about the use of technology in the classroom. And sort of a closing thought here from Selwyn. Technology must be seen in terms of limits and constraints. So when we talk about limits and constraints, it means us thinking not only about what technology enables us to do, but how it might limit what we're able to do. So it imposes constraints on us. If we depend on technology, it can also limit some of our actions and some of our decisions, as well as giving us increased freedom. So we need to kind of think about that. What are the advantages, and how does it broaden the possibility, and how does it also limit and constrain? So when you constrain something, you draw the edges in, you make it harder to do something. So how does technology enable us to do more, and to what extent does it limit what we're able to do? And there you've got a reference list, and I think it's worth just flagging up that reference list, because when you come to do the assignment for this module, you're going to have to provide a reference list, and that's how you set out a reference list. You know this already, you've done it in year one. Just a reminder, of course, it's arranged in alphabetical order by author's surname. So Brunner comes before Illich because B comes in the alphabet before I. You need to have the author's initial, you need to have the year of publication in brackets, you need to have the title of the book in italics, and you need to have the place of publication and the publisher. So if you're using any of the books I've referred to here, you can just take this reference and put it into your reference list. There's no reason why your reference for this should be in any way inaccurate. So this would be a good thing to remember to come back to this as a way of checking that you're doing your referencing correctly. And that's the end of my first short lecture on Introduction to Technology and Education.